This bonus episode was recorded on the road, so sound quality is going to be rough in places. If you don't want to listen to that, I totally understand. I also have a passenger in the car with me today, as usual. That's one of our dogs who has conditions which make it difficult for him to breathe. So for time to time, you're going to hear some coughing or wheezing along those lines. So if you choose to listen to this episode, please bear with me in that regard. He's a good boy. The subject of the bonus episode, as I will no doubt explain later when we shift to that section, is not really a recap, but a detailed overview or survey of a campaign that was inspired by and in many ways given shape by the Queensryche concept album, Operation Mindcrime. It was not an attempt to recreate Mindcrime as an experience for the players. They weren't put into Nikki's or Mary's or Dr. X's specific positions. Instead, it was set up to make it possible for them to wind up in roles like that if their decisions took them in those directions. And if they chose to do nothing, which I didn't really consider at the beginning of the Chronicle, if they chose to do nothing, then what would that mean? The title of the Chronicle was Broken Homes, and it was part of a larger Chronicle, which I will explain as we get moving, which was called The Lie in Belief. The main characters were all mages in Mage the Ascension. They were created initially for the first edition of Mage the Ascension, and they were converted over for Mage the Ascension 2nd edition. The specific details of a lot of the day-to-day play of the Chronicle have, at least as I drive along, have been lost to time. It has been 25 years since the Chronicle came to an end, and that means it's closer to 27 years since it started. So please forgive me if I'm not quick with the names of particular characters or individual cool events for each character that happened. But I'm also focusing on the Chronicle itself as inspired by Mindcrime, and that's the focus, is on how the content, the setting, the story, the characters, and the mood of Mindcrime informed how Broken Homes played out over its times, fitting into and around other existing Chronicles. Okay, so the game in question is, or the system in question is Storyteller for the World of Darkness. In the original 5 games of the World of Darkness: Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, Wraith, and Changeling. And I hope that if you've listened to episode 3.10, that this bonus episode that connects to it will answer any questions or satisfy any desires you'd have to know a little bit more about this war story of a sort. This is a bonus episode for the Casting Shadows podcast, and is connected to episode 3.10, season 3, episode 10. And the reason why it's being made is not that new information has come to light or that anything has developed further. It's simply that there was too much stuff to talk about in the previous episode, and the specifics of a campaign and how it turned out, a war story, if you will. The specifics of that were the easiest thing that could be excised from the whole and cut it down to a mere 48 minutes. So, if you didn't get what you were looking for in episode 3.10, this bonus content might be what you are looking for. So I'll pick one of the uses of Operation Mindcrime that I've used in the past, and I think to make it easier and to tighten the connection with the episode for which this is a bonus, we'll make this from Mage. This is in the 90s, and this is an adjunct or an offshoot chronicle to a main chronicle. Right? So that chronicle was called The Lie in Belief. And it started out as a Vampire the Masquerade chronicle because that's all that had been published at the time that it started. And then it added Werewolf when it was published, and then it shifted to second editions of all these games as they appeared. It added Mage, it added Wraith, and on a very superficial level it lasted long enough to add Changeling, but I moved to Korea before Changeling second edition came out, so those changes didn't get made, and we didn't pay an awful lot of attention to Changeling. But the world slowly revealed itself like a very bloody and very dangerous onion over the course of years that those games are being written and released. So this particular war story, and which draws upon direct inspiration from Queensryche's incredible concept album, Operation Mindcrime, happens well into our play of Mage, and is around the time that Wraith was released. We had a lot of different Mage chronicles running with different game masters, different storytellers running them, all set in different periods and set in different locations. But this particular chronicle that I'm talking about was set within the bonds of that original The Lie in Belief chronicle or campaign structure, which means it was set in the city in which we were living, and it was set in the year in which we were living. There were some superficial changes made to the city to reflect it having had a different history, but for the most part, we could play simply by walking around town, or we could have, like a tourist map out on the table and mark off territory or quickly indicate where we wanted to go and that sort of thing. And everybody would know what that place was like, what it sounded like and what the buildings were like. It was an instant and easy way to immerse ourselves in setting. As play went on, the fact that the supernatural was real became a given, and we developed certain shorthand for things. And so by the time that Mage came along, it's well established the dark side of the city, the fact that the murder rate is far higher than the murder rate of the real world, that the missing persons statistics are far higher than in the real world, that the perceived corruption or the exaggerated or conspiracy theorist level of corruption perceived to be in the government, or that could enjoyably be a part of fiction on 90s TV, such as in the X-Files or Millennium. It was very easy to imagine that this was real, a real part of the fabric of this, fictional environment that our characters were living in. And In a sense, it was a projection of some of the things that would come in, some of the freedoms that would be lost, some of the militarization of the police, which to my players seemed ridiculous and yet happened. These sorts of things, I find both interesting and sad. And these elements, how the world of darkness affects normal humans, these were far more important to our use of Mage than they were to our use of vampire or to our use of werewolf. So it really did seem like an excellent fit to have this kind of street level story that is Mindcrime, but then to cast it in terms of Mage and to make some decisions out of the gate. Like, if Mindcrime were to have happened, where would it have happened? Was this really a Canadian story? Because I'm from Canada, and this particular chronicle was set in the port city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a partly industrial, partly port city. At the time, it had less than 300,000 people. It's a twin city. One city, Halifax, on one side of this very large harbor, and its sister city, Dartmouth, on the other side of the harbor, and they're connected by suspension bridges. And there's lots of opportunity for campaign ties or chronicle ties that link into smuggling, that link into environmental issues, that lead into or stem from industrial collapse. This was a region that relied heavily on seasonal industry, which meant large segments of the workforce at different times of year are out of work. So there are gambling problems, there are addiction problems in the real world, and these can easily be magnified to point out and use for thematic purposes in play. Mindcrime slots in here perfectly, but yet Mindcrime seems connected to our American neighbors. Whether we imagine it taking place in a huge city where it's easier to be anonymous, like New York, or in how we perceive Chicago and its neighboring cities to be much farther away from us. But the idea that Mindcrime is a movement, right? It represents a movement, and that there are characters like Mindcrime's protagonist in every major city across the United States. And now it's spreading north, into Toronto, into Montreal, into Edmonton and Calgary, into Vancouver, and yes, Virginia, even into Halifax itself. This idea of, for a price, I'd do about anything except pull the trigger. For that, I'd need a pretty good cause. And so play in Mage, right? Mage the Ascension, it's all about those causes. It's all about those struggles. It's all about things aren't what you perceive them to be. It's all about normal people all around you who just want to keep their heads down and keep their minimum wage job and not make any trouble and not have anyone else cause trouble. And can't you just stop complaining? And someone's gonna come, and the nail that sticks up is the one that gets pounded down. All of these things and these elements, they all seem very real, and like we could just look out the window and see a house where those thoughts are legitimately in the real world passing through someone's mind. If I can just get to the end of the week and get paid, everything is going to be all right for this week. That kind of frustration is necessary. So when it came time for this Mage Chronicle to start, the players began producing characters like that. They were interested in the orphans. They're interested in the Hollow Ones. less interested in the major traditions, which we had already explored in other chronicles. And being able to kind of tailor their own approach to magic was becoming more attractive. And it made it easier to keep it focused on mage politics, while at the same time making it believable and almost acceptable for them to get tangled up with other supernatural, let's say, creatures. Right? Everyone knows that Wraith is coming and that I'll be folding it in when it does, so they want to be the type of mage that can connect with whatever it is that Wraith turns out to be. And we already know that we're playing in Halifax, and we already know that somewhere, under all these layers of normalcy, there are vampires. And we already know if you go in the right direction out of the city, you might not come back again, because there's a very small but very aggressive tribe of werewolves ready to bring their fight to the worm. And of course, they're playing all of these characters. They know who the vampires are, they know who the werewolves are, and they know how well they're hidden. They know how many layers of secrecy there are between them and people who have no idea they even exist. Right? So into this already highly detailed and fully accepted and setting in which everybody is already participating, we introduce these mages who basically know nothing, right? Who have drifted into the city hoping to be able to find work, hoping to be able to find a mentor, hoping to be able to find other people like them, just like so many disaffected kids end up doing in the real world. Just like many of the people who were playing the game had done themselves. So that there was a very easy bleed between the emotions of the characters and the outlooks of the characters and those playing them. So we had players of different ages. We had people who were closer to 30 than they were to 20, and we had a couple people still in their teens. And, these are the characters that they chose to create. This was not played regularly. It was played sometimes as a surprise. I'd say, hey, we're going to play the mages this time. And it was played sometimes in between, major events in one or the other chronicles. Or it was played as counterpoint or as a way to expand perspective. And having the through line of Mindcrime as the feel and the atmosphere of it made it really easy to switch to for me. But that it was based on Mindcrime is something I wanted to keep to myself, so that there would be lots of freedom in play, that people wouldn't automatically identify with the protagonist and then go down this self-fulfilling prophecy toward an already identified destiny. Rather, I wanted to have that situation that creates the concept album's story of Mindcrime. I wanted to recreate the conditions that make that story believable and see what happens. So we've talked about in episode 3.10 what the themes are and what some of the interactions were in character. But this bonus episode, which still seems to have so much like backstory to wade through before we can get to the events, is focused more on the characters. So I mentioned that it was tied to a theme of betrayal, a broad-based, high-level theme of betrayal, and whether this is the character betraying themselves or betraying their own ideals, or whether this is someone that they trust betraying them, or something that they think is definitely fundamentally true turns out to be false, or at least is something that they can challenge because of an experience. This is how I'm approaching play. So we have some halfway houses, and we have a vampire character, an NPC vampire character, that as they're vampires, they don't particularly trust. And as they're werewolves, they believe they have co-opted, right? We won't kill you. You know, they've turned him to become a spy. This is part of the corruption that their werewolves were experiencing because of their proximity to the city. They were willing to make a deal with a corrupt being, a worm-tainted, vampire, a leech, in order to hopefully gain some leverage in the greater arena of their struggle against the worm. So, as vampires, they don't fully trust this character. As werewolves, they don't fully trust this character, but they have completely different relationships with this character. Someone that they're keeping on the outside, or someone that they are, actually using as a double agent, or as a spy, not a double agent. And who is someone they hope is not a double agent. And so the same character is involved in making sure that some of these street kids are not on the menu, and is making sure that the rezoning projects, which are wiping out the low-income housing, which are wiping out the parts of the city for the purpose of gentrification of any place where they might set up a reasonable halfway house or low rent housing where these people could stay, right? So they're relying on a vampire, and they get a new perspective about this character who went by the name of Caravari. They're relying on this character to keep them safe, even though they recognize that fundamentally he is a predator. But the allure of the vampire, they're allowed to enjoy this now, because now they're playing humans with special powers. They don't have any cultural or instinctual resistance to the worm, and they're not locked in a nightly struggle of trying to gain dominance and try to carve out a safer position for themselves within, a very stratified vampiric society. So it's very liberating in that sense. It was also, I think, had a transgressive feeling to it. They know that they're dealing with the dark side, but at the same time, how else are they supposed to survive? Okay. The other major NPC in the group is a mage, just like them. Built to be like them, but a little bit older, and not involved in their activities, but there as someone to bounce ideas off of, someone who's going to take care of all of the stuff that we don't want to role play, like going to community meetings, or making sure the rent gets paid and the electric bills get paid and that sort of stuff, so that we can focus on exciting mage adventures with magic and belief and paradox and the technocracy and keeping your head low, but also learning how to keep your head high. So this character is similarly someone who starts out in a position of ambiguous trust. So unlike the vampire, who they start out hoping they can come to trust, but they're protecting themselves emotionally and physically from, this mage, they're starting out trusting, but they're worried that about losing that relationship, that something might happen to reveal something about this character that they don't like, or that this character might be suborned by one of the other factions. And again, this is informed by how they know the supernatural forces within the city already work. Right? They meet this character, they understand what this character is doing in the city and what they're interested in, what they're trying to accomplish, and recognizing which of the player characters this is going to come in contact with in the other chronicles. So this allows a very quick shorthand of getting that feeling, that sense that someone isn't going to live very long, that we might have in real life because of their habits, and would take too long to explain or set up, as this bonus episode is clearly demonstrating. Okay, so where does Mindcrime fit into all of this? Well, I decided to keep all of the figures, or figures like the figures in Mindcrime, I decided to keep all of them outside the bounds of the supernatural. They are normal, they are mortals. And these will be NPCs that the characters know, these will be contacts that they make in the course of play, and any one of them could end up being like Mary, or any one of them could end up being like Dr. X. But there did need to be someone at the beginning who was pushing a specific agenda of resistance. And I found it interesting right off the bat that the characters were evenly split between male and female players, and evenly split between male and female characters. And there were 6 in the group when it launched, and it shrank down to 4 regular players, partly due to schedules and partly due to things like character death, and so the shifting between the different chronicles that they were playing in. So when they were introduced to this political activist character who was really hoping to use the halfway house situation as a political tool, they didn't end up trusting this character. And I was trying to portray the character as honest. I wasn't sending body language cues or other cues that this was a character to mistrust. But something about the character they didn't like. So this became a character whose activities they would hear about in the background through other NPCs, or through reports on the news. I was in the habit of making radio reports, using other voices and editing the audio so it doesn't automatically sound like my voice. And you just have them playing in the background. You have music playing in the background, sometimes in some scenes. So the characters are driving from one place to another place. I'd put on some background music and then slip into the flow of songs, news reports from radio DJs and things like this. So they would hear about these different activities, and this figure was gaining more and more traction in public, right? But they also knew that he had an underground persona, that he was doing things to prepare for or protect himself against being acted upon by the government. So they're not going to be able to silence me, right? So he showed some signs of going toward the radical activist or maybe even conspiracy theorist direction. But at the point where they met him, he was still relatively fine. So as they're learning about him secondhand, I get to exaggerate his qualities because they are secondhand reports. And I've decided that the media is not there to report honestly. It's there to compete economically. And, that's become nothing but more true since those days. But they trust this character less and less. So as the chronicle moves forward, these are very small stories. This is something that I like. These are not large scale, save the city from destruction, or save this community or that community from some terrible fate. It was much smaller than that. They were looking for a safe place to live. That would be one story within the Chronicle, is actually getting a place where they didn't have to worry about being evicted, where they didn't have to worry about what was going on in the streets outside. They didn't have to worry about whatever gang might take offense or try to recruit some of their younger or more vulnerable charges. That it was a place that they could trust enough to move into and then make more safe as they grew in understanding and ability as mages. They began to collect information. So one of the things that I wanted to do early on was enable them to learn about more of the supernatural activities that are happening in the city by virtue of one of the great strengths of mages in the world of darkness, and that's information gathering. So they began to minimize the disconnection between what they knew as players and what they knew as mages. And I got to have some fun here by distorting the information that they were getting, right? And which had spin-off effects in how they approached play in the other chronicles. Because what if the mages actually had the better information, and what they thought was going on as a vampire, say, isn't really the whole story? So that really augmented play in the Vampire Chronicle as a spin-off benefit. But as they are securing their position in the city, as they're starting to feel like they're carving out a niche for themselves, that they are in a position where they might be able to broker some truces or keep themselves safe or ally themselves with the right force in the city to keep themselves safe, then this figure that they don't trust, this normal, mortal, political activist, possible conspiracy theorist guy, begins to act. And he has recruited some of the members from their halfway house that they have lost, and some of those have the beginnings of magical ability, and he is connected to this much larger movement in the United States, and he's managed to smuggle in some activists of his own, and one of them is magically active as well. And so now we have two different competing poles. We have the magicians who will use their magic for evil, and we have the mages who are trying to use their magic for the benefit of the people that they're taking care of. But that might turn out to be selfish uses. So everybody's skewed toward the darkness already. And we start portraying the activities of this activist group as a little bit over the top, a little bit like Robin Hood, a little bit heroic, a little bit cool. It wouldn't be cool if we did that, but yeah, we'd get our head chopped off, if we even tried it. How did they get away with it? This kind of stuff, and some pretty overt things. And as I'm not using Mindcrime, I needed to bring in other. I'm not using Mindcrime the album in play. Mindcrime is a real album that exists in the game world that the characters might listen to. And so, from time to time, its music will show up because it's a part of the fabric of the setting, but it's not something I'm imposing as the game master to cause an effect. I'm using other music, so I'm drawing on Skinny Puppy mostly, and there is a fabulous song by Skinny Puppy which begins with a quote that says, "All good people are asleep and dreaming." Well, this perfectly fits into the texture and feel of Mage on a fundamental level, but also into this chronicle on a specific level. And so while the characters were out trying to solve a problem, and keep it from erupting into something that might get into the newspaper, they're interrupted by this very 80s style black van, with huge mag tires and tinted windows and this enormous sound system, and it's blasting out this song by Skinny Puppy, and they're able to tell, because they're mages, that there is a magical effect working in concert with the music, which is going to cause, in a sense, a metaphorical awakening. The crowd, which is already agitated, is going to be pushed over the edge into riot. And the fun part is that the characters agree with the riot happening. They're worried that the people are going to be hurt if they riot. But if the riot were larger, if more people were involved, if it became not just this small neighborhood thing, but a citywide revolution against the corrupt power structures which are in place, well, that's tempting, that's alluring. But they doubled down on their beliefs, and they decided to counteract this group and make it so that the effect was limited. The riot doesn't take place. So they've had several opportunities by the time this rolls around to become or not become like the protagonist in Mindcrime. They've had several opportunities to become like Mary, and the opportunity is always hanging over them to become like Dr. X. Right? So are they going to put themselves close to positions of power and get what they want through blackmail and other means? Are they going to create a network of assassins or activists or terrorists or monkey wrenchers or the like? Or are they going to continue to isolate themselves and seek just to get by? Right? So as you can tell, when it's phrased that way, there really aren't any good decisions. There's no, from a benefit of society point of view, there are no good outcomes. But all the outcomes can easily be perceived as the right thing to do. This society is corrupt, and we know that deep down, right? The rich guy who controls the mayor, who allows the police to be corrupt in the way that they are, who has allowed and encouraged the militarization of the police force, who has, kicked so many people out of their crappy housing so that now we have a homelessness problem. Like, we know that that rich guy who seems to be behind it all is, actually the pawn of a vampire, right? So there's corruption beyond the corruption beyond the corruption. So while it might be foolish to have a small riot against the housing situation, which is just going to get smashed by the police and never appear in the newspapers, well, wouldn't it be interesting if the entire city rose up and demanded change, right? Then it would be possible to strike at that heart of darkness behind all of it, maybe. But continually choosing to protect themselves and protect their young charges, well, if they don't protect those kids, no one will, right? If they don't keep those kids out of the hands of the corrupt, no one will. And the kids aren't old enough, mature enough to resist all the sorts of temptations that are available just from the mundane and mortal world. And without even getting into the supernatural enticements. So every decision is bad, yet every decision is right. And I think if we examine Operation Mindcrime, we can see this playing out in the background. When we look at who each character is, why does Mary do what Mary does? And why does our protagonist feel about it the way that he does? And what really happened? And why is Dr. X, the man with the cure? and what is wrong? How can it be stopped? What if it became so terrifying for a corrupt politician to stand up and screw the people that actual well-meaning, well-trained people got into those positions, that it wasn't just the corrupt feeding trough of one generation preparing the next generation to perpetuate the corruption and the nepotism and all those things which enable societies and cities to sicken and die. All right, so we've got all these details ramped up to 11, and this is happening not because this is my background or this is some message that I want to get out there. It's happening because Mindcrime is steeped in it. Mindcrime puts it in your face. It stuffs it down your throat. It rams it in your ears. It waterboards you with the idea that, there is a problem. There is a real systemic problem. And it doesn't answer the questions. It just poses the questions. And so that is how I put the Chronicle together. So in the end, of course, by, in a sense, turtling around their halfway house, they lost out on many opportunities to improve their position, to increase their territory, to increase their awareness, to gain alliances, to gain favors that would allow themselves to protect what they were trying to protect. And so they were driven out. They barely escape with their lives, and they end up having to flee into the United States. And, well, as I've described at the beginning of this incredibly long bonus episode, this movement is far more widespread, and it's had several years now to grow. Major players in the United States political landscape have been knocked off by these anonymous gunmen, these anonymous expendable gunmen who, come out of nowhere with seemingly nothing to lose. Why? Because they legitimately have nothing to lose. And the way that they are used, they have nothing to gain either. And so that's where that chronicle ends, and it sets up a subsequent chronicle with some new characters, some characters recast as NPCs, and some recurring characters who recognize that they've jumped out of the frying pan and are now in the fire. But that's the story for another day. All right, that's it. I didn't expect it to go for 38 minutes or whatever, so my apologies. I'm relating this from the point of view of, well, it's been almost 30 years since we played it, and from the point of view that I don't know how many people in the audience are all that familiar with the various World of Darkness games and all the things that go into making the different characters and character types and traditions and spheres of magic important or relevant. And getting into all of those details would, of course, take us farther and farther away from the unifying purpose of making the bonus episode, which is talking about the influence of Mindcrime. So, there you go. I hope it was a bonus and not a torture. Until the next time, take care. You've been listening to the Casting Shadows podcast, hopefully available where all other podcasts are available.